Hello, fellow book nerds, and welcome to Library Card. I'm Megan. I'm here with Brian and RJ. And this show is really for people who want to think deeply about the books they're reading and get inspired to read more. And the way this is going to work is that each episode is going to be a deep dive into one book. We're going to have a really thoughtful conversation about our reactions and feelings about the book. And this has been inspired by our offline conversations. We've been reading a lot of the same books and texting about them pretty relentlessly. And we thought it'd be fun to kind of bring our conversations online and have more of a structure to our conversations and go really deep together. So this is a new show, so we really want to get listener feedback. So please reach out and let us know what you think after you listen to the episode. But we are trying something new today. So I want to know how you guys are feeling as we head off into this new venture. And Brian, I'm going to start with you. How are you doing? And what are you reading right now?
I'm doing well. I am immersed in all American history right now. That is all that I'm reading. That is all that I'm listening to. Currently reading a book called The Age of Revolutions, which is about all the revolutions that happened from like 1760 to 1830 on either side of the Atlantic Ocean, to try to better understand similarities between what was happening with technological changes and civilizational changes over a 60-year period in time that is tied together with the American Revolution, something I've been reading a lot about over the last year or two. I'm listening to a biography of Andrew Jackson, and I'm also listening to a book about America since 9/11 and how it impacted our overall culture. So I have a fiction book that is on tap. I have to finish one section of my nonfiction book based on my overall ridiculous process, which is going to be about a high school in eastern Colorado. So that will bring me to the present and more of a localized community. So lots of stuff going on right now, all American history.
I always forget that you read so many books at once. That's something I'm very impressed by. I can't do that.
It's a strange process, but I can't shake it now.
Yeah. RJ, how are you? What are you reading?
I'm good. Not anything that Brian's reading.
The opposite of that. Not that.
I'm about to finish this book. It's a little too corny for me, but I do like these like murder mystery fun books. It's just like the dialogue is a little too cute. It's just a little much. I'm like probably 30 pages left. I'm ready to. I'm moving on to Wandering Stars next, which is my wife's favorite book of the year. So I'm excited to get back to Tommy Orange, who is one of the best living American writers, and I don't think he gets enough credit really, but I hope he will get more.
A friend of mine who reads a lot as well just texted me that I have to read There, which is Tommy Orange as well, right?
Yeah.
That you guys just read?
Yeah, I just read that. He's very understated. He's kind of sneaky at how good he is. It's very casual writing, and so it's not highbrow literature, but it's pretty incredible. And I think that's harder to do sometimes. He's really good. I want to read that book too, but I like There a lot. It's really good.
What are you reading, Meg? How are you doing?
I'm doing good. I am reading this book, The God of the Woods by Liz Moore. I'm almost done. I have probably like 60, 50 pages left. It's good. It's a mystery. It takes place in the 70s, which is my favorite decade. And it's about a missing girl at a summer camp. And it's very readable. Lots of themes of like class and feminism and family secrets. It's good, but I do think the story is getting a little repetitive. I have to say, they keep like looking for someone to investigate, and then that person's missing, and then they need somebody else to investigate. That person's missing. So I'm curious as to how it's going to wrap up, but it has been really enjoyable to read, and it's a very much an absorbing universe to be in.
I've had that one recommended to me by many people. It's on the list. That will probably be a future Library Card episode. I'm just gonna throw it out there.
I can see that. What do you think, RJ?
Yeah, her last book, which it was the first, which I read, called Long Bright River, it's about Philadelphia. It's about the drug kind of epidemic in Northeast Philly, and it's probably better than God of the Woods. Totally different, but she's a great writer, I think. But can we just talk about genres for a second, because I wanted to tell you guys about some like things that were happening in the book world real quick. It'll be 30 seconds. Can I just do that real quick? Because it leads to a question about this
Yes.
book.
Tell us
Please.
about the things.
Okay. So so James won the National Book Award for Fiction. That was announced, I think, maybe yesterday or the day before. And I think James will win more, but James also won the Kirkus Award. But so there's now the Goodreads like choice awards, which like readers can vote on their favorite books in different categories. So this book, God of the Woods, is in mystery and thriller, not
Okay.
fiction, which I guess is like fine, but James is in historical fiction, which I think is just like this idea in the book we're going to talk about today is in historical fiction also. And it's like, what isn't all fiction historical fiction in some way? Like it's
Yeah, that
talks
doesn't
about
make
like
sense to me.
God of the Woods could be historical fiction about like the culture of the 60s.
Yeah.
You know, like I think of like Anthony Doerr or something as like historical fiction. It's like recreating a very specific moment in history with a lot of significance and putting like a fictionalized set of characters and situations around it. And it mostly in the past, I think, has happened with like war books, you know, like Jeff Shara or something, you know, it's like
Mhm.
these are like it's fictionalized history, right? But now I just feel like this whole category is like anything that happens in the past is now historical fiction, and like mysteries aren't fiction. They're like it's a different category. Mystery and thriller is not the same as a fiction, which I guess I don't know what to do with all this. And then there's like a horror or like science fiction. I would put in a totally different category because I don't understand it. But like historical
Same.
fiction, historical fiction, and mystery and thriller being like different. Maybe thriller can be its own category, but I think like a mystery, historical fiction, and fiction, like those are just like books to me. So I don't know. Do you guys think we need all these categories? Is that helpful, Brian? Does it help with context?
I mean, I love categorization,
We know.
but I'm gonna but I'm gonna zag a little bit and say I think we're just trying to give out more awards to more books so that we don't get blowback for not giving out awards to certain books. Because everyone's online, everyone's talking about this sort of stuff that if your favorite book did not get nominated for some sort of an award this year, you're gonna have an issue with it. You know, super online fans and that sort of standpoint, and just the larger culture of, you know, the literary world. I think it's an interesting point you're making about all books based on the past being historical fiction, because I've always thought of historical fiction as specifically around like like a famous event or famous, you know, moment in time that we are now adding
Yeah.
fictional elements to it. But you're absolutely right that what we're going to talk about today fits that category. You know, we're talking about the expansion of medicine, and we're talking about regionalism, and how the, you know, and how modernity reaches these parts of the world that are you know, left behind in a lot of cases for a while. And so that could theoretically be historical fiction. I think you're right. There's too many categories.
It's super bloated to me. I mean, historical fiction is about accuracy of a time and place, and I think I agree, Brian, it's really specific to one time and place in history, and so a sweeping book like today's book that covers 77 years is not historical fiction because he's not trying to recreate each of those time periods accurately. He hasn't done like 100 years of research. I seriously doubt it, and I think I teach genre in 3rd grade, right? I teach different genres, and you have to know there are specific elements to a genre that makes a book that type of a book. Like a mystery book follows a specific pattern or a specific outline of the book. That this book is a fiction book that just happens to have a mysterious element to it. It's not a real mystery. It's mystery is like it's much more of like what you're reading right now, RJ, right? That's like a classic mystery story.
Yeah.
I think it's bloated, and I think Brian's right. It has to do with like awards, and it's totally nonsense. These are all fiction. Covenant of Water is fiction. I think.
I also know that there
First
is
hot take of the show. Come on,
Yeah.
guys,
Yeah.
let's go.
There we
First hot
go.
take.
There we
We're a
go.
podcast now.
Do you guys know that there is a category called romantasy also? This is the thing. So
Oh,
I just want you to know.
I'm grossed out by that. I don't want to read anything in that book. And if you pick a book like that for this show, I will skip that episode. Just telling you.
My
I don't.
last piece of news, Megan, and then I'm going to give this back to you, is that Orbital was selected as the Booker Prize winner. I read almost all of the shortlisted books for the Booker Prize, but not this one. But you're going to read it and tell us about it.
Yeah, I have it next. I went and got it. And it's a soft cover. It's a paperback, you guys. I'm so excited to read a paperback. Like, I've been carrying this thing around. I carried like huge paperbacks to like the Vampire Weekend, or huge hardcovers to the Vampire Weekend show. Like, I am sick of carrying hardcover books around. So I'm ready for a paperback. It's thin too. It's like this big. It's great.
It looks really, really good. I'm gonna read that
Right?
this winter.
Yeah, it looks good.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's get into today's episode. We are talking about The Covenant of Water by Abraham Verghese. Covenant of Water follows 3 generations of a close-knit and haunted family in southwestern India. It spans the years from 1900 to 1977. It is set in Kerala on India's Malabar coast, and it follows 3 generations of a family that suffers a peculiar affliction. In every generation, at least one person dies by drowning. And in Kerala, water is everywhere. And the book really follows the future matriarch of the family throughout her life, from her early marriage at 12 until she has grandchildren. And I think a good place to start is, I want to hear from both of you about your takeaway after reading the last page. What are the themes that have resonated with you after the book? RJ, why don't you start us off?
All right. This is so fun, guys. New pod, same
This
peeps.
is fun.
Brian is still in the upper left-hand corner because he arrived first, as usual. Okay, I think my takeaway was that, like, I think the idea of like a sweeping family history that after reading the last page and after reading the last chapter ties things together. You know, like it's a complete story. As Brian kind of alluded to, it was a little more like medical than I expected, which I have some thoughts on later about why I thought that was good and not good. But the big kind of like tie in at the end, the big reveal, if you will, it kind of left me with more questions than answers, and we can talk more about that. But I thought that like the book itself did a really good job of getting into like the details of life in India during this time, and like culture and food and family relationships, and you know, the marriages, like all that stuff. But the ending really kind of hit me like a little bit like a non sequitur, and I might have just been like, after 727 pages, I was like, please just tell me what's going to happen. But I do think that the book is not really about that. You know, like it's not about what happens on the last page. Not like
No.
some of the books I'm sure we'll talk about in the next couple of months are all about like, how does the plot resolve, whereas this is much more about like the characters searching for answers and the answers that they do or don't find, and whether they're happy with them, which I think is kind of interesting. So I guess it kind of hit me like where I was, instead of like crying, I was sort of confused. Those are the kind of the 2 ways that I feel when I end books.
You either want to be crying, and you want to be crying. I know you. You want to be crying.
Most of the time I
Yeah.
am, whether I like it or
Yeah.
not. But that was my takeaway. But I like, what a sweeping family history that gives a lot of context for a particular place and moment in time, which I think is really great.
Brian, what did you think?
I mean, I agree with a lot of what you said there, RJ, because I think that as we get into this, like there were some flaws in the storytelling that left me wanting something more, which is a hard thing to ask of a book that's over 800 pages. But ultimately, you know, like the thing I loved the most about this, which you hit on, the slow passage of time just dictates everything. This book is not necessarily about, this is a weird thing to say, but it's not necessarily about the characters. It's more
Totally.
about life, and as life is happening and evolving. I kept thinking about how we as people return to the small stories in life, told in such great detail. Like that was such um, that was such a part of the book. Like when you open this book, trying to understand this young girl who's being shipped off to an arranged marriage, and you're trying to understand the landscape that you're in, and it's also foreign to you as a reader, especially from a westernized world. And then that all just expands and blows up, and then as we reach the end, it's just all these small details once again, and that was something I really loved about it. But then also, this idea that we're at a base level, we as individuals are comprised of all the good and the ill of our ancestors. And you really got this
Mm,
sense in reading this that, like, you can't really escape the challenges that your ancestors bring to you and pass down to you through blood, through genes. Um, but you also uh, get some of, and a lot of the good that they've done to the world, and even in a flawed way. So I think more than anything, like that, the fact of time, because as you mentioned, Meg, this is a 77-year long book, and a lot of it, you get into a scene, you get into a part of these people's lives, you read 3 pages, and the next chapter is a year later, and you've got to just follow along. You've just got to be along for the ride.
mhm.
And by the end of it, you got this sense of, I'm going to close this book, but the story is going to continue. And if this story continued for the next 40 years up to the present day, um, how much more is going to evolve, how much more is going to change. And I think more than anything, that's what the book did ultimately, like really well. And I felt that at the end was this sense of, I could just be on this journey with these people and with this within this world, regardless of, you know, a sort of plot point, regardless of any sort of story arc.
Yeah, it's interesting. You both mentioned something that I really latched onto, and that is there's a rolling sense to this plot. And like you're saying, Brian, it could just continue without us, which is like kind of the feeling of water, right? I think the main theme for me is the passage of time, what time does to us, how it changes things, what it makes relevant. There's a quote in the book that says, one of the characters says, I have been bent and broken, but I hope into better shape. And I loved that because it's so poetic. And it also just speaks to this idea that we are pretty insignificant in life, but hopefully we can find like good in those insignificant moments and those changes. And it also is comforting in that way. There's like it's so sweeping and huge, and the people feel really small in the story, which is something I'm going to talk about later. And you mentioned it too, Brian, that there's not, you never really, when you start to fall in love with a character, they're either gone or you're moving on from their story. You don't ever get a really super deep character dive. And so they have an insignificant feel, which makes you kind of realize that, like, in the grand scheme of life, we are also insignificant, which is, but in a weird way, he has a hopeful tone to that. I'm not sure how he does it, maybe because he's super idealistic, which I'm going to talk more about later, but it's a very kind of romantic, idealistic book. And I think that that gives it a sense of hope, even when it is really tragic and you are feeling so small and insignificant. And the last theme that I really thought of a lot is this is really a love letter to where one is from and who they're from, similar to what you're talking about, Brian. I've been watching this show recently. RJ, you just started watching it too, Say Nothing. And it's about the IRA in Ireland. And my family's from Ireland. And this is the opposite of that. Like, Say Nothing is this like dark, like harsh look at Ireland and the people from Ireland and how awful they have been to each other. And this is the opposite. This is a really romanticized view of this country and how people treat each other in this country and how people love each other and what's passed on from family to family. So I thought the book had some really, really big themes that are pretty ever present throughout the whole entire book. So I think now we're going to move on to talking more in depth in the book. And I do want to give a heads up to everybody that we're probably going to be giving out some spoilers here. So if you're listening and you haven't read the book and you don't want certain plot elements ruined, you should pause this and listen to it later after you've read the book. But if you don't care, you should just keep listening, or hopefully even listening to this after you read the book, because then you can really get into it with us. But the first thing we're going to talk about is what this book did really well. Brian, why don't you start, because you brought this book to us. This was your recommendation.
Yeah, this is my recommendation. This was given to my wife last year from a close friend of ours who said it was his favorite book of last year. She read it, thought it was an absolutely amazing book, and told me I had to read it. And I kept having it on my to read list. And then finally I was like, okay, I'm diving in. And I felt like I talked about this a little bit at the start, but this book abandons the kind of traditional main character journey in a way that I think it either works or it doesn't. And, I thought it really worked well in this book in a way that you were just along for the ride with a place and with a family as a whole, and with these big themes of medical advancement and modernization. Um, and as a result, once you got the rhythm of the book and kind of started to anticipate how sections will close out and start anew, and as because I think there's like 10, 11 parts to the overall book, and they hop between various characters. As you understood that evolution, it was really, really fascinating to, from a structural standpoint, just abandon the main character and abandon that these people you're going to be following them throughout their lives. You're going to be following them throughout parts of their lives. Many of them are going to die. Many of them are going to die in really brutal and kind of surprising ways, in a way that I hadn't. I've read in a few books, but I hadn't really been a part of for a book that I really loved. Um, like, in many ways, the modernization of India is the main character here. I think like the theme of sacrifice was the main character here, and so I felt like there was an element of this book that had it been written by someone with less of a command of language, would have just fallen apart, because you're clinging to ideas and you're clinging to themes more than you're clinging to an individual person, which is how so many stories are based off of. I think as well, um, you know, I don't read a lot of Indian literature. I tend to read a lot of Western literature just by default. Um, for me to be transported to a world that's not regularly featured in Western lit was absolutely fascinating, and was something that I think, had, again, had the writer not been able to really give you a true sense of place, and really, like, I felt like you could feel the dew, and you could feel the humidity, and you could feel like the rocks underneath people's feet, and the way the rivers just roared in this area. You could smell the surgical unit in a lot of spaces. That allowed me as a reader to be transported to a world that I just don't typically read about, and was immersed in for um, however long it took me to read it. So I think large scale, the idea of it abandoning a traditional main character's journey and giving us more themes um, could have been a huge failure. And in this case, it made the book for me in a lot of ways. What do you guys think?
Well, I have a question about that before I pass it to RJ, and that is, one of the criticisms of this book is that it's more voyeuristic, and that what it's teaching you about India is almost like from a Western perspective, which I found really interesting. But I'm curious if either of you felt that. Like you said, Brian, I don't read a lot of Indian literature, so I probably am not the person to judge that. But they were giving a lot of examples of like other writers that write more. And maybe this is also because it's so sweeping and big that it is more general, but they were giving examples of others writers that write more kind of less voyeuristically and more from the perspective of that culture. But I don't know if you guys have thoughts about that.
I could see that argument being accurate, and I also don't totally care. Like,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
as I was reading it, I was enjoying it. I was transported to a world that I'm not typically in. If there's a book that I should read next from this could be a great stepping stone into a genre, into a world that I don't have a lot of familiarity with. But I tend to find a lot of those arguments are, well, okay, like, it was a great story that gave people perspective on a world that they may not have gone after without it. You're absolutely right. There's like a level of depth and a level of authenticity that you kind of have to accept, um, is not going to be ever present in a bestseller like this.
Yeah.
And you kind of just have to roll with that or not.
Yeah. RJ, how about you? What do you think this book did well?
Well, I guess I never really thought about that while I was reading it, the point you guys were just making.
Mhm.
But like, given the fact that the author was born in Ethiopia to like Indian parents, I'm like, that just didn't really cross my mind, because I kind of like just trusted his perspective. So I
Yeah.
didn't really think about that. I think the things that it did well. I think there's a really like interesting um, take on, and probably a pretty different take from like other literature like this, on this British imperial period, especially as it's ending, and Indian independence, and what that did to like the economy and the economies of small villages and families. So I thought that was like pretty interesting. I do think the family dynamics that were, um, you know, there's different family units that are kind of part of each part of the book, right? So I feel like
Mhm.
there were quotes like that. I think I sent you guys this. Like, we don't have children to fulfill our dreams. Children allow us to let go of the dreams we were never meant to fulfill. There's
That's
like,
pretty incredible.
yeah, they're like great,
Yeah.
great quotes like that. So I think like in terms of how families relate and don't relate, and then, in terms of the kind of like secrets, which I guess is part of the whole idea, the secrets that families have and try to understand. I thought that was really cool. I like that, like what you were saying, Brian, about the setting, and particularly like just the author's dedication to like that piece of land itself as like the main character. It's
Yeah.
almost like kind of like Northwoods in that way, where like the main character is the place, which is kind of cool. Um, so I thought that went really well. And I thought that the medical piece, like, this is much more like than I expected, although I hadn't read his other books, and
Oh,
apparently
yeah.
it's kind of like how he writes, because he's a physician. Um, but but that part of it was like, I'm like not a medical person, so that part was
Yeah.
like, did not hit me in the same way that it probably hit other people. But I think like that context of it brought into the historical period, and the British being there and then being gone, and how progress happens, I think was pretty interesting and really cool.
Yeah, I agree. I think there is a piece of the book that is instantly transporting. Like, when you read that first section, I was so sad when then they switched to another section, because you are immediately there. And I thought he did that so well. Well, this is not going to surprise either of you, but my favorite thing that they did well in this book is that I think it's a deeply romantic book. I mean, we don't get to dwell in the love affairs the way that I would like to, but there are some just utterly devastating romantic scenes and lines in this book. There's a quote in there: "If two people at the very same moment hold visions of each other, perhaps atoms coalesce into invisible forms like radio waves and connect them." Devastating, beautiful. Although the flip side is that he does tend to romanticize things like arranged marriage, child brides, a lot of suffering, like women being quite subservient, but it is part of the culture that he's talking about, but it is a little bit romanticized, and as a woman, I can't help but read those things through my current lens, and it is sometimes hard for me to feel like that is okay, and it's, like, beautiful that a 12-year-old is marrying, like, a 45-year-old or whatever. Like, it's hard for me to get on board with that, and you do by I think pretty quickly, because he's kind, but, how often did that really happen? It's just hard to put yourself there, but
Yeah.
yeah.
I think to that point, just to back you up, I think uh, he has so much belief in progress and modernity that he believes that that is a necessary stepping stone to modernity, and that
Mm,
it's okay that there was suffering, because on the other side, see, we made such progress, and see, there are good things that come from this, which I think is a bit problematic, because and again, how do you add more to an 800-page book? But I think you're
right.
absolutely right. There could have been something more, especially in that initial in the initial marriage, to give you a, hey, this is right here, in quotes, like this is accepted in this society, but like, let's give a little bit of perspective.
Yeah, and, like, it wasn't right then, it was just accepted, right? And so, like, yeah, I think that that's true, and also, like, because the woman because the mother in the end, when she, not Big Amici, I'm going to forget everybody's names because I read too many books, but when you find out, the mother who's the artist, and when she goes off to pursue things,
Elsie.
yes, when she goes off to pursue things for herself, it is such a fucking relief, because you're like, finally, there's a woman in this book who is not doing something for a man. And it is just, it's really the only female character in the book who has any sort of agency, which is interesting, and maybe a product of 1900 to 1977 in India, but it never sits great with me. So that's a great segue to what the book did not do well. RJ, start us off. What do you think?
Well, I think the what you said earlier about the relationships between the characters, I think they're, that to me is I feel like the characters were well developed. They deserved like a lot of empathy, but it was the emotional connection between the characters was really kind of lacking, I think, in a lot of ways. I think there was like long relationships that had a respectful and, like it sort of was like no one was really, there were no real bad people. It was just like everyone was a good person. Bad things were happening to good people. But in contrast to like books that have, where you really live in the suffering of the characters in order to then come to a point where things either turn around or they come to some resolution. Like for me, I think that character those like character developments are like Digby probably was the character that had the most kind of like evolution
Yeah.
as a character along the way because of all the stuff that he went through. To me, that is partially what I was missing in terms of like maybe it was just because the point was that like the characters you like got used to them and they died and then there were new characters came in, and so maybe that's
Totally.
just part of it. But I feel like because of the focus on the story and less on that kind of character connection, with the exception of Digby and the mistress and a couple others, it felt kind of unbalanced to me in that way. And I think they weren't like the characters weren't really developed emotionally. There wasn't a lot of
Mhm.
like I said, like negative sides to the characters, which is cool. Like I think you said, Brian, like the author is very focused on like modernity and progress and like the goodness in people, which I think is great. But I think to create that like that tension, between the characters, like the opium addiction that the son has, it was sort
Yeah.
of like it kind of just like happened, and then he got over it, and then he was like smiling and happy again, and it was like, okay, cool, I'm glad he like figured that out. But it wasn't like there wasn't a lot of texture to the negativity that came into these people's lives. It was like the kid, like, sorry, spoiler alert, like gets impaled by a tree, and it's like that sucks.
Yeah.
Well, here, let's go like do some brain surgery and figure out some other stuff. So I feel like in that sense, I felt a little bit off balance in that we didn't really get to live in those characters' minds as much as I would have liked in a book like this.
Brian, what do you think? Do you have comments on that?
I have
Before you
many
share
of the
yours?
same. It's interesting to hear you have those criticisms because I have many of the same. I think like specifically when Philippos, I think is his name, the main son. He's the third child of Big Amici, and there's all these great ambitions about his life. He's the first one to be well read, and he's the first one to be schooled, and he's going to go off and he's going to have this amazing experience in medical school. Meets this woman that he's in love with and has, as you find out, has been in love with for most of his life. They reconnect. It's this really sweeping romantic story, but like because of the sprawl, at times these big things happen and they would kind of feel inconsequential. And I think you're absolutely right to nail in on when he is enraptured in opium addiction. I remember specifically reading that whole section. I was traveling for work and I was in hotels and I was just like had like hours to myself, and like I had this book and it was the absolute perfect book to be reading while I had just like time in airports and hotels, because I would just like eat up 150 pages just like, and it's a total page turner in that sort of sense. But the problem I kept having was I was like, I know this guy just witnessed his son get impaled by a tree branch, and then he tried to save him. And by trying to save him, he broke both of his ankles and is now addicted to opium. And his wife is still trying to figure out who she is. And she's this amazing artist, and she's going through this evolution of her own. And he is like falling into horrendous addiction. And at the same time, I was like, there's 300 pages left. I'm just kind of reading this. Like, I'm not as immersed in this as if this was the main thing happening, because on either side of this one section, there's like 25 other huge moments that happen in life. So I think you're right. Like, I think it's a good critique that these characters sometimes felt two-dimensional. Oftentimes when I'm reading fiction, I kind of imagine how I would like to see this if a really good director made this into a movie. And a book this big, like, we're not going to even really entertain that. But I can't imagine this even being live action. Like, this feels like a cartoon in a sense to me, where like you really have to get these rich colors out of it, and these characters that kind of have like a musical quality to them, and they pass through your life. And I think you're absolutely right, Meg, in terms of the critique you're making about how they're treating women. And there's almost like you know, there's almost an excuse of like, well, this is just how things happen then. And so let's just walk through how things happen. And so there is this like push and pull as you're reading the book, where you're just continuously turning pages, and it reads
Mhm.
really enjoyably, but you aren't like wrestling with these big questions that you should be based on the experiences. Um, I think as well, just like one additional thing I felt like it didn't do well was, um, I would have loved a lot more of Digby's character, and I felt like
Yeah.
he was so important early on in the book, and then clearly so important at the end of the book, but there's this like 500-page chunk where he just doesn't appear, and every moment that was a part of his life was where I got hit the hardest and I related to the most. And yet as I'm reading it, I'm like, or as I'm reading through the book, I'm like, are we ever going to jump back to this guy? Because like, I just want to know what's happening in his life at this point in time. So those two things, like, I think that's the challenge of going after a book of this magnitude in one book, is
Yeah.
you're necessarily just like brushing over a lot.
Megan, before you jump in with yours, can I just ask you a question? Because or well, actually, do you want to just go first, and then I'll ask you guys a question?
Sure. That's perfect. I think questions are next, so that'd be great.
Okay.
He's
Yeah, I
jumping
mean,
ahead of the doc already.
he is. My God, RJ, I'm driving the bus today.
Come on.
Yeah, I think I just echo what both of you said. The book moves so fast, and I just never really felt like super connected to the characters. And when I would connect to a character, they would leave. I think also there's a lack of humor in the book that just kind of hit me. Like, no one's really funny. Nothing really kind of with edge happens. All the characters, like you're saying, RJ, have like goodwill, and no one's ever like making a really bad choice because people do that. And sometimes I want to read books about people making bad choices because that's just what life is. And I really feel like the reason I hadn't searched out for this book yet was because I did read Cutting for Stone and I didn't love all the medical information. It really takes me out of a book. I'm not interested in the really specific details of that. This book I felt like had less than Cutting for Stone, which was great, but it definitely has a lot of it. And it is like he spends more time on medical details sometimes than character development, which is not always my favorite. And the last thing I'll say is that it's a full painted environment. I totally agree with what you're saying, Brian, and that you really feel like you're there, but it's not lush in the way that like Gabriel Garcia Marquez is, where it is three-dimensional and you are in it. Like, there's moments when you're reading Marquez and you can literally, like, you feel like you are surrounded by the environment in a way that is completely absorbing. And I never felt that with this. I felt like it's really interesting that you said cartoon, Brian, because I did feel like I was looking down on it and away from it and distanced it instead of in the room with them or in the jungle with Marquez or something. There wasn't like an absorbing feel to it. And that's kind of one of my questions about it, but we'll get into that. But RJ, now I'm dying to know what your question is.
Well, wait, hold on, because I got to know this because what you just said just blew me away. So you felt like you were looking down on this. You didn't
Mhm.
feel like you were because I felt like I was in the room, in the land with everyone, but I felt like all the edges were fuzzy.
Yeah,
Where
yeah,
like it
yeah.
wasn't
Mhm.
like full of, you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
RJ, how did you like see yourself in this book, especially in is that where it
Yeah.
was located? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think like the details like I alluded to earlier, like the food and the house and the materials that were used for the building and like the trees. It's like it's very micro level, whereas like
Mhm.
I couldn't really picture like what the neighborhood looked or like where the river was in relation to the house. Like it just that part, but like I knew exactly like what they were eating. So I think like there were details on the
Mm.
very micro level and then like kind of at the higher level about like where the country where where these things existed in relation to each other in the country. So I feel like there was like a middle part that was kind of missing. It was
That's
maybe
I
fuzzy.
yeah. I always saw, like, the river and then, like, a big hill up to the house, and I could see everything, but it was, like, far away and always felt kind of distanced from it.
It felt like it was night and it was raining all the time, which I think may have had an impact on it overall.
Yeah.
Totally.
So, okay, here's my main problem with this book. The end, like I think it's really confusing. I think the secrets families share idea is like interesting, but then it's like the like drowning thing is now related to like a brain stem issue, which you can figure out if you
Yeah,
like do enough surgery, and that's fine. But then like this guy who we all loved, who disappeared for 500 pages, it turns out he's the father of the main character, and it's like,
I
and then
know.
and the mom never died, she's over there, and like we'll see what happens next. It just kind of like the whole thing, it felt like unresolved, and I think Brian, you said maybe that's part of the point, but compared to the next book we're going to talk about, which is also kind of deals with secrets families share and don't share, which is like so heavy and
Oh
not
my
even
god.
overdone, just perfectly like balanced. I think this was like so like it's kind of a medical history, but then there's also this thing, and like we didn't even know that this Digby even knew the mom, and now it's like the big reveal at the end, and you're like, I felt very caught off guard and almost like it was like a non sequitur, but I wonder if I was just like trying to rush to finish the book for some reason or another, or if you guys felt the same way about the ending.
The ending made sense to me in the this is going to sound really bad. So all right, we're already talking down this early in the podcast. The ending made sense to me in the fact that this is a Oprah book club book. Like I feel like there is a
Yeah.
requirement in those books that there is a true conclusion. And the book we're going to talk about next, like the
Oh,
most intense part about the book, which is saying a lot, is that there's no real conclude. Like you're left being like, what the hell is going to happen? Um, and so like I rated this book 5 stars for a very simple reason, because I couldn't put it down and I enjoyed every
mhm.
time I picked up and read it. And I think on a very simplistic level, that is what I'm looking for from fiction sometimes. And I've read a lot of fiction this year that like I just straight up did not enjoy. And this one, I read it. It was one of those books that like kind of perfect time in life to like just dive in and be totally immersed in a story. But that said, well, and with that, like, I was really pleased to have a true conclusion to the book, where characters who have been circling this solar system align in a way that makes sense. Digby, um, being with Elsie at the end makes sense based on decisions he had made earlier in the book and things he had had to live down earlier in the book. Um, the mom, um suffering from, help me out here guys, what was the leprosy,
Leprosy.
um helped, that made sense, based on themes of the larger book. The mystery of the new child, made sense, it all kind of like made sense to me. But I agree with you, RJ, on the sense that like it felt partially as though, okay, let's just get to the end here. And as I'm reading it, and I've got like 115 pages left, like I just kind of got to power through. And so there were flaws in that. Don't get me wrong. I enjoyed it while also being like, I hate to say this, it probably should have been a 1,200 page book. But I also like worry that like if he had been given 1,200 pages, what else is he going like I feel like he needed 1,000 pages to flesh out what he was trying to say. But if you gave him 200 to 400 more pages, he's going to introduce like 6 more characters and themes.
Totally. Would have just kept rolling. Like it would have just
Right.
kept going. Yeah, 100%. I mean, sometimes it's satisfying when books kind of get tied up in a nice little bow. It didn't totally bother me, but I like it when things are kind of, I don't know, it's a very kind of romantic ending that, that she finds this person who like believes in her art and helps her even though she's suffering. And I thought it was beautiful. But it is hard to care about how things end when you don't really have a huge investment in the characters. And that's kind of my question for you is, can a book really hit you to the core if you don't fully believe in or fall in love with the characters? And like the next book we're going to talk about, the characters are so intense, but you get to know them so well that you love them for all their faults and they carry you through the book. And I think for me, if I don't really love a character and there's not a really strong character arc in the book, it's hard for me to like truly, truly love the book. But I don't know what do you guys think?
I agree with that. I mean, when we get to the recommendation corner here segment of this, like recommend books that you think you should read after this, I'm going to recommend 2 books that move in this sort of sweeping big scale of this, but also had characters that I truly fell in love with. And the
Yeah.
next we're going to talk about like is all character driven. Without the characters, there's no book. This was more part escapism, part learning about medical history, part learning about evolution in rural India, part, hey, these characters experience that. It almost felt like, and this is going to sound really insulting, so I apologize, but it almost felt like the way that Forrest Gump worked, where it was like, you're just going to experience the evolution of America from the 1950s to the 1990s through this one person. And
Totally.
so you kind of like leave the characters behind and just like allow the book to take you like so I hear your criticism while I also was just like I was immersed with it. I don't know if it hit me to my core, but I was
Yeah.
definitely immersed in it as I read it.
RJ, what about you? Can you
Yeah, I
love
mean,
a book without the
no, I
characters?
mean, not really personally. I think I maybe made that clear earlier, but I do appreciate and accept it for the reasons Brian's laying out. Like I think that the ways you can it's a good reminder that not everyone experiences art in the same way, which we have to remind ourselves all the time on this podcast and on HF Pod and on everything else we do.
Yes.
Like it's
Yes.
like the way that books hit me is different than the way that books hit anyone else. But I think the points of why you love this book, Brian, are really great and kind of like complementary to mine. So like I find it a convincing argument. I think for me it's like it's all about characters, but I understand like I wouldn't the Oprah comment is really interesting and I hadn't thought about that as it relates to this book, but it makes a lot of sense. And I think like a lot of these historical fiction books that end up being super popular, like I'm thinking of like, you know, The Nightingale or whatever. Hi. Like The Nightingale or something, like those kinds of books where it's just like you're presenting like a period in history for like a large number of people. And I think that maybe is what happened with this book, but also I think your points
Yeah.
about Brian about the setting and the history and everything else I think is super compelling. So I think it can work even if it doesn't like if it's not like exactly what I'm looking for.
Oh, yeah.
My question related to everything we're talking about is pick a segment of this book that you'd like to see expanded into a 300, 400 page book of its own. Because I felt like we had a lot of segments that if you got more out of just that, the characters are
Yeah.
richer, the conflicts are more intense. Is there anything that comes to mind for you guys?
I think for me, it's probably between two stories. One is the Digby story. I think his initial like landing and his initial reason for escaping is so fascinating, and what he becomes and the world he creates is really interesting, and I really related to him, and I think that would be a fascinating story. And then, yeah, I think zooming in on Elsie's story is just super interesting. Like, I want to know more about her as an artist, and thinking about this person who works in all these different mediums and is so compelled to do art that like she can't not, and how that drives her, and the conflict of being a woman and a mother and an artist is something that's very fascinating for me. And so those are kind of my two storylines I'm most interested in.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that for me, like the end, because I did feel like it kind of left us with an open door,
So like learning more about like the relationship of Digby and Elsie and
Yeah.
how things go from there.
Yeah, just because I think at that point in the book, you're kind of trained to be thinking like, okay, so what's the next like group of people in this family, and what are they doing, and how to? But I do think, Megan, your point is like any of these characters could have been kind of excavated a little bit further. And I think that's part of. I mean, like the husband, who marries Amachi at the beginning. Like we don't really know anything about him.
Yeah.
No, and he's like kind of what Megan was saying about we're just accepting that these people are okay because life evolves and modernity comes. Like
Yeah.
he is the type of figure that you put into a movie and he kind of just like is typecast. And I think that there's
Yeah,
more
totally.
for
How about you?
me, I mean, it's the initial Digby segment. I could read an entire book about this kid who loses his mother in a really dramatic way, who gets educated, comes to India from a surgical standpoint, has an incredible mentor who turns out to be a total piece of shit, starts an affair with his wife, and then this horrible tragedy happens, which impacts him physically, ends up killing her, ends up putting him in a position where he's got to essentially flee for his life. I could have done an entire book on that. Like I thought that that was just a
Definitely.
fascinating look at this interesting aspect of the human condition, and uh like I felt like his character was so like when I first started him, I was like, wait, where is this book going? What is happening here? Why are we in Scotland all of a sudden? What is going on? And
Yeah.
then as they wrote as he emerged, he was such a I thought he was one of the most three-dimensional characters of the entire book. And you get to the end of his section, I think it was at the end of his first or his second section where Celeste dies, and you jump back and then you almost don't return to him until he has found himself in Paramble. And at that point in time, you're at this uh, you're now latching onto a whole new story while at the same time you're like 350 pages in, you're just along for the ride. Whereas I could have done a whole book on what his experience was like and what his life was like.
Yeah, I remember texting you when I got to that point because I was so immersed in Kerala, and then it switches to Scotland, and I remember texting you like, "I'm so sad that it just switched to Scotland." You're like, "No, you'll like it there too. It's gonna be good." And I was I did. Yeah, that story is fascinating. Like, that's the thing is that he has so many pretty huge stories embedded in this one other giant story, which is to his credit, and I think to what you're saying, really hard to do. Really hard to
I
invent
think
that much.
he gave himself an impossible task and probably hit it like 85-90% of the way.
Yeah.
And that there's a lot to admire in that sort of risk and in that sort of ambition. But I think what comes with it on the other side is if you are trying to keep this relatively readable for mass audiences, is you're going to skip past a lot of the kind of messy stuff that we like, and
Yes.
what we're going to get into in the next book, where there were like unending segments of detail and trauma and passion and anger and frustration and hopelessness that I think we all like really dug into and we're like, don't give me any
Yes.
more plot. Just
Yes.
stay here. Just stay here. And this book was more plot where you felt as though you were like, the details, while they were rich, they almost don't matter as much because I'm just along for the ride.
Absolutely. This book is utterly readable. I think that is
Totally.
definitely why I gave it 4 stars, and I think that's one of the reasons why. It's so readable. I agree. It's just super easy to read. Okay, I have a question for you. I need 3 words to describe this book.
So I have technically 4, but they are 3. Okay, I apologize. I always have
That's
to
a
give one
very
more,
Brian Brinkman answer.
but they're in 3 bullet points. All right.
Okay,
So
me too.
waterlogged, like the
Ooh,
idea of water and the idea of like drowning just felt
yeah.
like a part of this overall book. Simply put, heartache. Like this book is this longing sense that that I really enjoyed being in that space, even though it was really difficult at times. And then this kind of goes back to how we all viewed this book, but like blurred clarity. Like there were moments where I felt like I
Mm.
saw everything that came to pass, and I saw everything as was happening. But then there were also moments where I felt like I was almost like in a car going like 50 miles an hour, where you see the landscape, but like it's just all going by you.
Yeah.
Um, what about you?
Yeah, I think that's kind of the perfect way to describe how I felt when I was reading this book at times, being in a car and watching a lot of it go by. That's a really great image. Yeah, I think and I connect to the idea of water too. I think that water is the main theme of the book too, and this idea of like connectedness and how water connects us. I wish we would have talked. There's so much symbolism in drowning and water and what water means and what water does. And I don't know if the book is called The Covenant of Water, but I don't know if that was a fully realized theme in the book. But more on that later. I don't know.
Yeah.
Does that ring true to you at all?
It does. I mean, I think there's a hard way, like there's a choice of being obvious and being and like explaining it
Yeah.
versus letting it linger. And I think that he tried to find a middle ground where he wasn't beating you over the head of what the title of the book was and what the larger themes were, but at the same time let it be a little too mysterious at times that you didn't feel like, and this is bad podcasting, but I'm going to do it for like the 5th time. The next book, the title of the book, when it comes to fruition, and when you realize where you're at,
Oh
like
my
in the
God.
book, like it hits in such a massive way that it's the perfect title. This I felt like this was the kind of book that you mentioned it. It's very readable, and so as a result, it loses some of that thematic depth
Yeah.
because it is trying to just keep you going to the end.
Yeah, and I guess the only point I'd argue against myself here is that because of the rolling plot and this feeling of time passing and being in a car, maybe that feeling is what water is like in a river, right? This idea of like moving, constant moving and interconnectedness and how things kind of like all come together into one place. But okay,
It's an
so
interesting
yeah.
theme because sorry, like that just like
Yeah.
I like that, because ultimately part of the struggle that these people had was an imbalance that made them drown easier and made it harder for them to survive in
Right.
water. And so as a result, like you as the reader are trying to stay afloat and trying to stay, within the book as it's just churning along like like a river.
Yeah, and water as a life giver and something that takes away life
Yeah.
too, right? Yeah. Cool. I guess maybe he's onto something there. Maybe I'm not giving enough credit.
I think he's pretty smart, but like
Yeah.
I think he bit off a lot more than he could chew in the end.
Yeah, it's a pretty epic book. Okay, these are my 3 words. Reassuring, despite being very sad. That's in parentheses, so it doesn't count as a word.
Okay.
Um, idealistic and romantic. Those are my 3 words.
The idealism is something that like didn't hit me off the bat, but the more you guys have talked about it, the more I think about it. I think I was just along for the ride as we were going through it. And so I
Mm,
just kind of accepted some of these like cultural norms that he just accepts, and he accepts as like they all went away. So it's okay. And I think you're right. There is a bit of idealism to the book that took away from the harsh reality of a lot of these people's lives, especially women.
yeah, I think so. Okay, so then last part in this section is, what is a lasting image you have from the book? Like when you kind of think of this book, what image pops into your mind? Or one of
The
them?
scene where Nanan falls off the tree that Elsie had wanted cut down, um,
Mm.
and he's imperiled by one of the branches. Um, it was so grotesque and so tragic, and kicked off a section of the book that we've talked about here that was so intense, but also exposed a lot of the flaws of the book. But like that image that you needed, I forget where that happened, like 400 pages in. You
Yeah.
needed all the medical knowledge. You needed the details of Digby and Celeste being burned, while they were on their affair. You needed all this grotesque humanity and what happens in places of the world where medical technology has not yet reached to truly understand how dramatic, how awful this experience was. You know, I think anybody, even if you don't have kids, you can empathize with this, but like thinking of one of your children having a freak accident like this, you understand the like, oh, your whole life would be devastated and your whole life would take a turn that you don't see coming, and you can't really prevent all the tragedy that's going to come as a result of that. So like that to me, when I think back to this book, I think to that scene and everyone gathered around as he's hanging from this tree, in a way that like just wraps up everything that I feel about this book. How about you?
Yeah, that image is so intense. I think also that is an interesting part of the book too, because it sets off that idea of suffering and what it does to people who suffer together. And, and that's just something that I think is a theme in the book that's really interesting. The image for me that when I think about this book is when they find out, when you find out the daughter finds out that her mother, Elsie, is the leper. And there's this garden that you've seen a lot at Digby's, sanatorium. And it's in the middle and it's really beautifully described, and it's always kind of in shadow, and there's always sunlight there, and there's always like a mysterious leper in the middle there, and you don't know who they are. And when he tells her that that's her mother, that moment was always very evocative for me and really beautiful and pretty poetic, and just an amazing kind of circular moment. And it's almost like a counter to us saying like he ties everything up in a bow, because that is pretty awesome, because the way that the history of the sanatorium and how Digby's found his way there, and how you've walked past that courtyard and that leper many times and you've never noticed, and you didn't realize that it was this super powerful, amazing woman that's so central to the story. I thought that was incredible and a really beautiful moment. So I loved that. That's kind of an image that I've taken away. And the other images of her nest that she built, the piece of art in the woods, I'm fascinated by that. I could read a whole book on Elsie, as I mentioned, but that piece of art that she creates in the woods, because she can't create one in a studio because he's ruined it, because he's addled with drugs, and she's out there in the woods. Like, to me, it really spoke to like the way so many women feel about a desperate need to express themselves. And I can't even imagine in that society, in that time, how rare it was for a woman to have a space to express herself artistically. And I love that she makes one in the woods. It's just, I thought that was beautiful.
I think just to build off of that, one thing I loved structurally that this book did, it's kind of a slightly a cop out, but it's also just I have to admit it's a move that you make in writing that I find really, like, when it's well executed, I love it. So she disappears. They think that she's drowned, and then when we find out that she is the leper and that she's married Digby, and um, we uh, we go back and we get this kind of retelling of everything that happened. And so you're in the story, but you're going back into the past and you're tying together this whole part of the book that was left as a mystery to you for a couple hundred pages. It's a very bestseller move, but
Yeah,
like
yeah.
I have to admit, like I was enraptured just like covering all the bases and making everything up, or making up all this mystery at that point in time. It just I enjoy that.
Yeah, I do too. It's a gimmick, but it's a gimmick because it works, you
If it
know?
works, it really works.
Yeah. And maybe not a gimmick isn't the right word, but it's
It's a
a
structural
commonly
decision.
used right, it's
Yeah,
a commonly used, structural piece, but it's hard to pull off well, and especially when you've written a book of that size. I mean, that's like you've got a lot of stories to tie together, so
right.
it's true. It's good. Okay, we're kind of at the end of this book and this talk, but I'm wondering if you have a final thought about the book or anything we haven't talked about that you wanna make sure we talk about.
I'll just tie it up in a bow, the way that the book was tied up
Just
in a
like
bow,
Abraham
just like
Verghese?
yeah. What I wrote about this is it's a force, the structure, the waves of characters and themes, the way that you grasp onto a character in a place only to lose it, the way that it sneaks back, the colors that you can see and smell and taste while reading. It didn't so much bowl me over as let me live in it for some time in a way that I truly loved, even when I
Mm,
was occasionally frustrated or briefly lost. And I think that that kind of like speaks to my larger feeling of this book that like there's a lot I can critique and that we've spent the last hour breaking down that we felt like, okay, it could have done this better, could have done this better. But at the end of the day, I wanted to keep picking this book up and reading it. And that's a pretty rare treat. There's a lot of ambitious books out there that do not live up to their expectations. And I think that this one, at the very least, made you want to continue to live in it.
yeah, I totally agree. My kind of final thought is that plot-driven books, when written beautifully and romantically, can transport me. And even though ultimately I really love a character-driven novel more, this is definitely one of my favorite things I've read this year, and I don't think it's gonna make top 5, but it'll definitely probably make top 10. I mean, we'll see how it shakes out. But I've read some
That's where I'm at.
really? I've read some killer books this year, so it's in stiff competition, but I totally agree. I didn't wanna put it down. I loved reading it, which is a lot. It's a really big book. So and it's a hardcover, so it was a commitment.
It took up a lot of space in my carry-on luggage, and it took up
Exactly.
it took up a lot of like, it was like carrying around just like, like a
Yeah.
weight almost.
This is the book
Yeah,
I brought to Vampire Weekend, like, because I had a 45-minute train ride both ways, and I was like, "I am not gonna not read a book for an hour and a half today," and so I brought this book to Vampire Weekend, and it sat on the ground in front of me in my seat.
the one thing I will say about that is, like, this is one of those books that I think, to its credit, you can kind of open up and just read, in
Mhm.
a public space, and even if you only get 3, 5 pages into it, you are very quickly transported, which I've read some books that, like, you need to be in the headspace to go into. And this was one of those books
Totally.
like it doesn't require a ton of effort so that you're able to just pick it up, be at a concert, be on the train, do whatever and read it. And sometimes you need a book like that.
Yeah, maybe that's one of the reasons why I loved it so much too, because, I read the Tim O'Brien Things They Carried this year, which I read at the very beginning of the year, but incredible book, but, like, that book is so intense, you don't really wanna read that on the way to a concert, you know? It's a bit much. It's a bit heavy. But this
We
one,
should
you
have a
definitely
section of
can.
we should rate these books on can you read it on the way to a concert?
Yeah, that's real nerd shit. Okay, so what are some books like this book that you'd recommend? And I struggled with this a little bit. So I'm curious to hear what you think first because this was hard for me to find books that I felt were similar to it.
So I have 2, and
Okay.
they're 2 of my favorite books. I would rank
Ooh,
them far higher, but I thought about this in the sense of not necessarily setting, not necessarily time and place, but more in terms of like this epic sweep. These are 2 books I think does what this book attempted to do much better. And I'd be shocked if people out there haven't read these, but if they have not, they absolutely need to. The first is East of Eden. The family dynamic, the sweep of one family to another, the sweep of good and evil, America and California California as it's sort of modernizing and figuring itself out as a force to be reckoned with, but doesn't totally understand how to get there right now. The colors, I mean, that's perhaps my favorite book I've ever read, so it's a very, very high bar here. But if you're thinking stylistically, what am I getting into? This is that is similar. The other I would recommend is Lonesome Dove. Very different from a thematic standpoint. That book has far richer character development throughout it, in a sense that, like, I can hear how Gus McCrae sounds. I can hear Call as he's contemplating the next hill to climb as they're going through the prairie. But what that book did really well that is similar to this is gives you, let's just say, like 30 characters that you're going to latch onto, and some of them really matter and some of them don't, but they all have some richness to them that you want to, every time you kind of dive into a new character's experience in the context of the book, you get a little bit more color and perspective out of the book. Whereas this did that, at its best. You would just dive into a character and see, oh, this is what the caste system feels like. This is what medical technology is like in the early 20th century. This is what addiction feels like, so on and so forth. Where he used kind of characters as thematic engines.
Yeah, I feel like I'm going to have to read Lonesome Dove just because you and RJ talk about it a lot. So I feel like I'm going to have to
think you'd love
get
it.
in there. Yeah. I mean, I've never really been into the Western genre, but this seems to transcend that in a way that I'm interested in. But East of Eden, one of my favorite books I've ever read, definitely was on my list to recommend too. I read that book in my 20s and I need to read it again because it rocked my world. Like it's absolute. I mean, it's a classic, but it's an incredible book. The two books that I'll recommend, one of the books I read this year, fantastic book, very different, but Lincoln Highway by Amor Tolles. It's just very different, but also a love letter to a certain time in America, and has two brothers enduring a lot of tragedy. And I think there's just a feeling of, the book takes place during a cross-country trip. And so there's a feeling of movement to it that I think is kind of similar to this book, and just a really great read. And the other one is Demon Copperhead, which I know we're going to get into in a future episode.
Yeah.
One of my favorite books I've read this year by one of my favorite writers of all time. And it's much more realistic, much better written. I have to say, I think Barbara Kingsolver is a much better writer than Abraham Verghese, but paints a real picture of a time and a place and follows a really tragic story of addiction. And I think it's totally different because it's character driven, but it has that deep rooted sense of place that I think is similar to this book.
I think it's a good comp. And I think like that book moved as quickly as this one did.
Yes.
But the difference being, you felt like you were immersed in, it felt like in Demon Copperhead, she didn't have the next place to get to.
Yeah.
Like she was going to
I
linger
like that.
and give you kind of the full, just gruesome reality of what it's like to be poor in Appalachia, while keeping the pace just at a rapid clip. And this kind of sacrificed a bit of that detail and that depth and the messiness for the pace. But I think
she's a genius at that, at being able to, sorry, I cut you off. She's a genius at being able to keep the pace up and go deep, which I think is so hard to do.
Which, as we've talked about, it's a challenge.
Yeah, it really is. Okay, so that's the end of our talk about the Covenant of Water. And we have an episode coming up, our next episode. Brian, tell everybody what we're going to talk about next time.
We are going to do a book that we all read in the springtime and that we were all deeply moved by, for I think very similar and probably, as we get into it, very different reasons, which will be very exciting. The Bee Sting by Paul Murray. This is currently my favorite book of 2024 that I've read. I can't wait to talk about it. I still think about this book on a day-to-day basis. I still feel the tension I felt when I read this book. If I ever made a list of favorite books I've read throughout my life, this is a top 20, I want to say. Just a total, just endless force. So I can't wait to get into it.
Yeah, same. This is my favorite book I've read this year as well. It's an absolute masterpiece and a book that I've recommended to so many people because it's absolutely just breathtaking. So I can't wait to talk about it. All right. And thanks to everybody that's been watching live. It's been so fun to see that there have been people who are nerds like us. It's awesome. And please let us know what you thought about the episode. Reach out to us on socials and you can send Brian a letter or give him a phone call or something. But let us know what you think. And we'll see you soon, book nerds. Thanks, everybody.